Welcome to the Markidini Crochet Along. I'm Tanya and I'm going to be showing you some of the steps to creating this beautiful Tunisian crochet blanket. To get started, we need to find our supplies. I'm going to be using worsted weight to demonstrate most of the stitches. That will give a fairly large size blanket if we make the largest size. It is similar to a 10 ply or Aran weight yarn. We need to use hooks. We might need to use some cable holders or another crochet hook to help with that. Scissors, of course, and some other supplies. So for your hooks, you will need to have a longer hook than a standard crochet. So Tunisian hooks, you can find some straight hooks that are very much like a knitting needle with a hook on the end. Or you can find what looks like a standard crochet hook, but you can add a cable on the end to hold extra stitches. So hopefully you have your supplies and we're going to get started. Before we learn the steps for week 1, we're going to make what's called a swatch. This is going to be our practice sample to learn new stitches and how to work some of the cables before we work it in the blocks of the blanket. So I'm going to use a similar size or weight of yarn just from my stash, my scrap, to do my swatch. The very first step for Tunisian is to pick a appropriate sized crochet hook. The general rule is to go up 1 or 2 or even 3 sizes larger than what is suggested for your weight of yarn. So on my yarn label, it suggests a 4.5 millimeter knitting needles or a 5 millimeter hook. So I'm going to look at where we have the crochet and 5 millimeter. I tend to be loose in my crochet, so usually with Tunisian I only go up 1 size of hook. So I'll be starting with a 6 millimeter hook. The written pattern or the introduction for this crochet along has a couple of good examples of what you want your work to look like or not look like. So we don't want it to be too tight. It will curl up a lot if it is too tight and it won't have nice drape. We also don't want it too loose. It won't hold its shape quite as well for working the cables. So you can refer to that guide for what they should look like and we'll help get started. So for my swatch, I'm going to start with a starting chain of 11. So we're going to start learning the Tunisian simple stitch. This is the basis of all Tunisian crochet, the one we use the most often. So our designer recommends turning onto the back side of our chain, and you can see how the back of the chain has this extra loop that looks like a bump. We are going to be inserting our hook under those back bumps, starting with the very first chain. You insert your hook, yarn over, pull that yarn through to the front, and leave that loop on your hook. So 2 loops on the hook, and we'll work our way down the chain, pulling up a loop in each chain, inserting a hook through that back bump or that back loop on what is usually called the wrong side of the chain. So just work our way down, inserting your hook on the back bump and pulling up a loop through each chain. When we get to the end, even though we chained 11, we should have 12 loops on our hook because we already had a loop on our hook before we began working down the chain. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 loops. So as I'm working through my swatch, I want to make sure that I maintain 12 loops. So that's called a forward pass when we go through and pick up our loops. There's also a return pass in Tunisian crochet. You will yarn over, pull through one loop. So it's almost like making a chain. Then we yarn over and pull through 2 loops on the hook. Okay, and this is one spot you can adjust your tension a little bit. If you're finding your piece is narrower than the recommended guideline, you can pull through just a little bit extra on that return pass. So that makes one row, the forward pass picking up the loops and the return pass pulling off the loops. So now for the Tunisian simple stitch, you can see how these loops are all around the front of our work. That's what we insert our hook under. We don't use this farthest edge. Insert our hook under that loop, yarn over, and pull the loop up. That is one TSS, one Tunisian simple stitch. So you just work your way down the row, pulling up those loops. And again, this is another place you can control your tension a little bit so it doesn't get too loose. We don't want to pull it too far. We want it to slide on the hook, not be tight, but we don't want it so loose that it's sloppy or falls off. Now, when we get to the far edge, this time, instead of just inserting under that front loop, to make a nicer side edge, I'm going to turn it over and I'm inserting my hook under both the front and the back loop of that stitch. So you actually see 2 on the hook as you insert, pull through, and pull up. So that's the forward pass. Remember, now we need to make that return pass. So you yarn over, pull through 1 loop or make a chain, yarn over, pull through 2, and repeat that all the way back to the beginning. So in Tunisian crochet, we're always working on the right side, or the right side of our work is always facing us. We do a forward pass and a return pass. Okay, and you'll see a little bit of holes after you've done your return pass. Those will fill in as we work our next row. But if you find that those holes aren't filling in very well and it's quite holey, you will want to go down a hook size and try again. So you can practice a few rows of this Tunisian simple stitch, and I'll meet you back here soon to learn one more stitch, remembering on the far edge to put your hook under 2 of those edge stitches before pulling up a loop. So we're going to learn a new stitch now, the Tunisian purl stitch. Before we do, I just want to show you how we can count our rows in Tunisian crochet. There's a couple of ways you can do it. You can see the return pass going horizontally through. You can count those horizontal lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and this top one, 5. It's also quite easy if you turn to the right side of your work. This sort of V shape is our first loop, or the edging stitch. So you can just count the V's, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I've done 5 rows of TSS, or Tunisian simple stitch. You're welcome to work as many as you want, especially if you're new to Tunisian. It's a great idea to make several rows of each stitch pattern to get used to it and consistent tension. So the TPS, or the Tunisian purl stitch, we're going to work on now. It is worked almost the same as the simple stitch, only before each stitch we want to bring our yarn to the front of our work. So there's a couple of ways to do this. The one I have gotten used to, I will be showing you, as I use my hook. And I'm using a different color as well for the purl stitch. So I just use my hook to bring that working yarn forward, insert my hook under that loop just like for TSS, and then wrap the yarn around and pull up a loop. So you bring your yarn forward, wrap, pull through for a loop. Bring the yarn forward, so depending on how you hold your hook and your yarn, you'll have a slightly different method of bringing that yarn to the front. But you always want your yarn, so you could drop it in the front, insert, pick it back up and wrap it around, whichever works for you. Again, being careful after we've done the stitch to just tighten it up just a little bit so our stitches don't get too loose. And you can clearly see, especially when you're using two colors, how it creates a different effect on our work. And the same thing in the last one, we don't pull it to the front, we just insert through those two side edges and then yarn over, chain one or pull through one, yarn over, pull through two. So the return pass is exactly the same as we worked for the TSS or the simple stitch. The purl stitch, we pull through two as well, except for that very first loop. Okay, so pull the yarn to the front, under that first loop, wrap around and pull up a loop. And that is the Tunisian purl stitch. So you can go ahead and work a few rows or several rows of that until you get used to doing the purl stitch. I find it's a little bit slower than the Tunisian simple stitch, but makes a really nice design as well. So you go ahead and practice a few rounds of that. So how'd you do with the purl stitch? Hopefully you have several rows worked and have kept nice and consistent tension throughout. You can definitely see the different texture between the Tunisian simple stitch and the Tunisian purl stitch. So before I work the next new stitch, I'm going to work just one row of TSS. It's a little bit easier to show you after that, so I'll just go ahead and work another row of TSS. You can do so if you'd like, and it'll be just slightly easier to work the next new stitch with TSS or the simple stitch. So remember the difference, the TSS, we keep the yarn behind our work before we yarn over and pull through. So the last stitch that we're going to work on for our practice swatch before we get into the blocks of the crochet along is the Tunisian knit stitch, or TKS. So we know that we have this loop on the front, and if you turn your work over, or you can see how the loop goes around the back as well. So when I open it up, you can see this strand on the front, and here's the one that's on the back. So for Tunisian knit stitch, we want to work not in between these loops, but we want to go in between that front loop and that back loop of each stitch to insert our hook and pull up a loop. So we insert under this through both of those loops. And as we do that, it sort of twists or turns the loops forward, and you can see both of them forming that sort of V at the front. Once we've worked a couple of rounds of this, it becomes a little bit easier to see. So what I think of, instead of just going under that front loop, I go under it and then push my hook into that hole or that space between the stitches, and that's worked then in between the two loops. Okay, and then at the end of the row, we insert as we have for the other round under those two side loops to pull up a loop. Okay, so it's good every now and again to check how many loops you have, that we haven't lost a stitch somewhere. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so yarn over, pull through 1, yarn over, pull through 2 for that return pass. So our return passes so far have all been the same for these basic stitches. Okay, so I'll show you one more time. For the knit stitch, instead of just going under that front loop, we want to go under and between. Here you can see this back loop a little bit better, between those 2 loops. Push through to the back between the 2 loops for our Tunisian knit stitch. Then work the return pass as before. So you can go ahead and work several rounds or rows of the TKS, the Tunisian knit stitch. And if there's any of those 3 that you want more practice on, just keep adding to your swatch. And I will see you back here for week 1.